Are we now live? Wonderful. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for braving the heat. Although, honestly, it was cold this morning. Yeah, but it won't last, sadly. How many of you saw the rainbow that was out with the storm? It was just gorgeous, wasn't it, the other night? Anyway, thank you, virtual audience, for joining us. And we have a three-part program this out, a triple threat. And we're going to start with Ellen Crosby, whose new book over here is called Blow Up. And coincidentally, a Supreme Court justice is a very shady character in this book. So sometimes fiction catches up to real life. I know. Love it. Sorry, but that's how I feel at the moment about the Supremes. And then we have Kate White here in this beautiful orange dress, which I so much admire. And Kate's new book is called Between Two Strangers. And then Jen, who's somewhere in the store, where is she? Jenn McKinlay, is taking a light touch with summer reading after we have two kind of, heavy books. So not heavy, but darker. So anyway, that's our plan. So I'm going to start by talking to Ellen and her book called Blow Up. Ellen has a long history with the wine country mysteries. Many of you may have read them, which are set in Virginia, right? And we have some of the paperbacks up front. So why don't you tell us about those? And then we'll move over here.
Okay, so the wine country books, I've written 12, and they started the first one came out in 2005, and the last one came out last year, so it's been a while. But they're the story of a woman who owns a vineyard in Middleburg, Virginia, which is called the Horse and Hunt Country. It's very beautiful, and she as I originally was going to write one book. My British literary agent wanted me to write, when she heard about a trip I'd taken to Virginia when we were living in London. She thought it was a great setting for a book, and I said, I'll write one. And then it turned out I wrote 12. So as I got more and more into the series, I thought, well, how am I going to keep doing this? And how am I going to do something that sort of intellectually intrigues me to spend a year writing the book? And there's so much history in Virginia. I mean, the country started in Virginia. I'm born in Boston. I used to think the country started in Massachusetts, but it didn't. It started at Jamestown, and we have most of the Civil War was fought in Virginia. We've had presidents, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. I mean, we have a lot of history in Virginia, and so gradually, all of the books, sort of what I came back to was there would be sort of a contemporary plot, but I would find something in history, the War of 1812, the Underground Railroad. Oh gosh, I can't even remember. There were Jackie Kennedy. Thank you. Yes, Jackie Kennedy used to ride in Virginia all the time, and so there was just always some historical element to weave into the story, and that I think was what really appealed to me. And so the when I finished the 12th book, I wanted to go back to this series that I had written before. So and I wrote 6 books, and then I wrote this book about a photojournalist named Sophie Medina, and I wrote 2 books, and then I wrote 6 more, and 8 years later, I'm coming back to this one. So it's been a while, and I'm hoping that it takes off.
Well, I hope it does too. Now, you have to remember that Thomas Jefferson was not successful in growing grapes and making wine
This
in
is true.
Virginia.
True.
But climate change is such that they are now actually growing grapes in Scotland. So Virginia is actually a very reasonable place now to have a winery. And it is truly a beautiful and very, parts of Virginia are very rural. Which is sort of a
Yes.
surprise.
Yeah.
Ladies, there's plenty of seats right in there, so dive in. Anyway, I really love the wine series, but one of the things that I've always admired so much about Ellen's books is that she's a brilliant guide to come on up here because there's a terrible gap in the front row. So Paige Shelton can be that person. I love it. Thank you. Right. Right. Yep, you're perfect. But I think your husband chickened out. You took the chair. Right. Um, anyway, one of the things that I've always admired about Ellen's books is that she is fabulous, not just on history, but on landmarks. And even in the wine country mysteries, she took us up to D.C. and gave us some tours of the Capitol and so forth. Now, Ellen was a journalist for a long time. So why don't you tell us the origin of Sophie, because it relates to your own journalism career?
Well, I decided that I wanted to write a book about a photojournalist, and I worked as a journalist. I sort of tagged along with my husband, who was sent overseas, and I came into journalism through the back door. And so I started writing freelance things, and then we moved to Moscow, and I became the correspondent for ABC Radio, and then I worked for the Washington Post for a while. So I knew, I really didn't know anything about winemaking, except I knew what I knew was I like to drink wine. But I thought maybe I know a little more about journalism. And so I decided to make her a photojournalist because one of the things about as a journalist, you write a story and you have like 750 words to write your story. But a photographer has to get one perfect picture that really nails the story. And you look at that photograph and it's like, that's it. And so I was really intrigued by someone who would be looking for that one moment that would capture the essence of a story. So that's how I came up with Sophie. And it,
So where did we first meet Sophie?
well, she lives in England where I lived, and I've all my books have some sort of touch back to something that someplace where I lived overseas. So Sophie's living in England, and she's working for the equivalent of Associated Press that I invented, International Press Service. And her husband goes missing. He's a CIA agent who's in Russia, which is I also lived in Russia, and so that's sort of the premise of that story. What happened to him, and maybe he hasn't been kidnapped. Maybe he sort of went rogue, and what's gone on with him. So she ends up back in Washington, and then the story pretty much stays in Washington after that. So she goes back home. And even though my books are set in Virginia, for those of you who don't know Virginia that well, Northern Virginia is Metro Washington when all is said and done. I remember my editor one time, she said, and this is New York, I love them, but it's like, how do you know Virginia so well? And I thought, I live in Washington, really. I mean, it's not like it's not like it's really far south or anything.
That's
So,
very true. Although you could say the same thing going north to Maryland. I
yes,
mean, D.C. is actually a very big hub, and so
yep.
it's definitely Virginia, Alexandria, and so forth.
It goes out
Definitely.
even further
When I
now.
worked in Washington, I actually lived in the district, so I could walk
Mm,
up Independence all the way to the Library of Congress.
really?
Yeah, I lived at 4th and G. I
I
had an
didn't know
apartment
that.
there. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Martha Grimes. Remember Martha Grimes? She had an apartment in the same building. It was very cool.
Oh,
But that was
wow.
before I had a bookstore, so it didn't mean much to me.
Wow.
Right.
Wow.
And one of my favorite memories, I've always, because it in the winter, it gets dark early in Washington. And I was walking from the library back to 4th and G, and it was kind of a foggy night. And all of a sudden, from the Capitol emerged a figure in a stovepipe hat and tails and all, and it was Abe Lincoln. And I thought, really? Close, very close. And I kind of went, really? And anyway, so I walked on down a little further, sort of whatever. And when I got to a traffic light down at the bottom, there was a policeman there. And I said to him, I just saw Abe Lincoln. And he said, you did. You actually did. Okay. And anyway, it turned out there was some sort of something, and he was a reenactor.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And he was strolling off the Capitol grounds
so
where he was going. But it was a really dizzy moment there. It's like, so
yeah.
Washington does have a lot of ghosts as well as a lot of
Does.
history,
It
doesn't
does.
it?
Washington has some amazing history. I mean, I went to undergraduate school there. I went to graduate school there. I got married there. My oldest son was born there. My husband worked there for many years. So I feel like I've known the city quite a lot. And somebody just asked me recently, though, they said, you seem to have a love-hate affair with it. And what I don't like, I don't know how much you've sensed it but since 9/11, it's turned into a fortress. It's just a
It
fortress,
was.
you
The
know?
first National Book Festival, which I helped organize, was the weekend of 9/11.
Yes,
And
it was.
it was inside the library. I did a mystery panel with Harlan Coben and Bob Crayus and Margaret Marin and Nevada Barr on stage in the Coolidge Auditorium, after which the Librarian of Congress, who I knew when I was an intern, came up to me and he said, we never thought a book event could be fun. But anyway, I took them all to the Folger Library, which is right behind the Library of Congress, to see a play on Sunday night to kind of wrap up everything. And the next day, we all went to the airport, and the next day was 9/11.
Yeah, yeah.
And we had talked as we walked across from the Folger Library, across the back of the Capitol and the White House, I mean, not the White House, the Supreme Court and all, back towards the hotel, that Washington was the most beautiful night we'd ever seen. The weather was gorgeous. The foliage was fabulous.
Yeah,
It was incredibly serene and peaceful. And that was it.
And then the BoucherCon, the big mystery conference, was there a few weeks later, and a lot of people canceled. Remember that?
They
Yeah,
did.
you came because that's where we
I
met.
came because the organizer wrote to me and he said, you're still coming, right? And I said, yes. And he said, we have 17 panels that need a moderator. So I certainly hope you're coming because I'm just going to run you.
A
And
lot.
I did that. Remember?
yeah,
I went
yeah.
all the way down, whatever it was.
A
It
lot.
was a real test.
It was.
Most of the people who came were from overseas. But that was also the weekend that the Yankees played the Diamondbacks for the World Series. And Ian Rankin and my daughter and my husband spent the weekend in the bar at the hotel. And I had this superstition that if I watched the game, the Diamondbacks would lose.
Was Ian a Yankees fan or a Diamondbacks fan?
No, that's a really good question. He was probably a Yankee fan. But I'm trying to remember Susanna Kersley. If any of you have ever read, Susanna had come down from Canada and she asked me if I'd come down and have a drink. And I said, I can't, because if I do, I will see the game. And she said, no, no, no. We're sitting in the bar and I have my back to everything, so I can't see what's going on. And there's a lot of noise and all. Susanna, bless her heart, she looked at me and she said, because it was being played here, right? She said, there are people running out on the field, leaping up and down. She said, is that a good thing? Proving how little she knew about baseball. And I thought, wow. So that's how I knew we'd won. Well, that was a digression. Let's talk about.
We always get off track. We talk about so many things. Yeah.
Blow Up is actually a terrific plot. I can't say much about it because it'll spoil it for you, but it does not go where you think it might. This is one of your very best and trickiest plots.
Thank you. I thank you. Do you know, it's interesting because there have been reviews, like the trade reviews, and it's like, well, why don't you just say who did it? So I was talking to a friend of mine who's a reviewer. There's some real spoilers. And he said to me that if you review a movie, you're not allowed to have any spoilers for movie reviews. And he said, I don't know why they don't do that for books.
I don't either, but people put up one-star reviews on Amazon because they're pissed about the cost or that didn't come.
Yeah.
And they take revenge by putting up spoilers. It's really, you should never, ever read an Amazon review thing if you are interested in buying a book, because it will almost always spoil it for you.
Review.
Well, yeah, they don't read those. I do. But I've already read the book. But seriously, this is really an astonishing book.
Thank you.
And considering, when did you turn in the manuscript?
I turned it in last September.
Okay, so almost a year, well, not a year ago, but 9 months ago. And this book could actually be taking place right now. And it's always interesting to me because of that long lag between writing a book and then turning it in. So actually, the book was probably written 18 months ago.
It was. And I didn't realize it would be so prescient. But it's funny because I had a lot of help with this book. If you read the acknowledgments, it's a really long list. And one of my friends, who's an artist, who helped me quite a bit with it, to just brainstorm. She said, well, why does it have to be a Supreme Court justice? It's so hard. And I said, well, there's only 9 of them. I think it's more interesting. I mean, anybody can kill a senator or a congressman, but let's just go with the Supreme Court, right? And I just was, it was before Roe v. Wade. It was before, there was still the talk about Clarence Thomas, but living in Washington and watching the confirmation hearings, the last couple of them, I just thought, well, maybe it's about time.
So we have Sophie in Washington who's still reeling with the death of her husband. Sorry, that is a spoiler, but it happens right up front. And she's still trying to find out what happened. He died in Vienna, if I remember right.
Austria, yes.
Yep. So that's a big question. But anyway, it's your story. You tell them what happens. It's just the opening bit.
She finds out that she was told that her husband was killed in a car accident, and she doesn't really believe it. So her husband worked, after he left the CIA, he worked for the former Secretary of State. In fact, my son actually worked for a firm that was very much like this, so I sort of modeled it on Brent Scowcroft's firm. So it was one of these firms that sort of does all kinds of, they work for governments and they help, they're problem solvers, and they do a lot of consulting and things like that. So her husband was working for Quill Russell, this former Secretary of State. So she goes to Quill and she says, what happened? And he can't really tell her. And she kind of figures out that actually it was something to do with the Russians, because he had been in Russia before. But so they have lunch a few weeks later. And he says, you know what, I really would like you to take some pictures of my home. I have this beautiful home in Middleburg, so I went back to Virginia. And I want to give my wife a book of our home at every single season of the year. And she said, I don't do interiors, I'll find you somebody. And he really prevails upon her to do it. And she agrees to do it. And when she's there, she comes across something she really shouldn't see. But I should say the basis for this was my husband his aunt and uncle who live in Vienna, Austria. Also, they have a small castle outside of Salzburg, and we used to stay there all the time. And the last time we were back in Vienna, Ernst had he put together a book like this for his wife, for Gretel, and it was filled with his poetry and love letters. And then somebody had they found a photographer, and it was every single season. And the book was just magical. And I thought, what a wonderful tribute that for all the work she had done to restore this little gem of a castle. So that was sort of the genesis for how Sophie did the book, and it was going to be based on the book that
It was going to be a present for their
their
long-term
where their
wedding
25th
anniversary,
wedding
their
anniversary.
25th.
So he gives her a year because he wants every single season. So, and he says, you'll come to the house when my wife isn't there, so we'll keep it a secret. So she has the code to the alarm, and he says, okay, she's a journalist, and so she's traveling a lot, and she's not here. You can go now. And so she goes out and she takes pictures of everything. All the rooms and all the little vignettes and the gardens and the grounds at every season of the year. And I always had this image of this castle in my, the book that I saw of the castle in my head when I was writing the book.
Right. So Sophie sees something she shouldn't see, and then
Um,
she's called to the scene.
oh, well, so then after that, she goes out for sorry.
I remember this.
I wrote the book too. You know what? I had to look at it today because I'm well into the next book, and it's like, what, who, what? So anyway, so she goes out for a run. She has two really good friends and she grew up in Middleburg as well, so that's how she knows Quill. Two really good friends. One's a journalist, surprise, and one is a former boyfriend who's a Jesuit, and he teaches ethics at Georgetown. So they're going to go out for a run. They go out for a run on Capitol Hill, and they come across the body of this former Supreme Court justice, and he's not doing really well. And they call 911, and he leaves and he goes to the hospital, and he doesn't make it. So what happens after that?
We don't want to talk about
Okay,
it.
we
But
don't.
one of
Yeah.
the things I thought was really interesting is that he needs to die in the hospital. If he dies where it is, it's a whole different deal. But if the ambulance gets him and he dies in the hospital, it's a different deal. And then I'm trying to remember
If he dies in the ambulance, he still dies in the hospital.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, but he can't die where he is.
No, because then you end up with a murder investigation or some kind. And I didn't want a police investigation. I wanted the whole thing to unfold. I had to talk to a funeral director. I talked to a former EMT and his wife, who was an emergency room nurse at George Washington University Hospital where it happened. I talked to another nurse. I talked to a lot of medical people about all kinds of things. And one of the more interesting things I found out about, all those HIPAA forms you sign every year? Do you know how important those are? You have any idea? If a hospital's caught violating any of them, it's like a $10,000 fine. Because one of the things I needed was, I need there to be pictures of the judge in the hospital. And I thought, well, maybe, he's famous or somebody does something. And it was the funeral home director actually said to me, there is no way. He said, you can't take a picture of anybody. You can't take a picture of anybody, the funeral home. You can't take a picture of anybody in the hospital. It's a violation of their rights. No. And if you do violate it, it's a HIPAA violation, and it is a $10,000 fine. So all those papers you sign, it may not mean anything to you. It means a lot to the hospital and the doctor and everything else.
Do you remember the scandal here at Mayo? Do you remember a guy went in, he was having surgery, he had an interesting tattoo on his penis, and one of the surgeons couldn't resist taking a selfie of it? I mean, not a selfie, but, sorry, a photo of it, and passed it anyway. Not only did he lose his job, which I think was right, but the really serious question, aside from the HIPAA rights and all, was why did he have his cell phone with him in the operating room? There isn't really any way to sterilize one. So I think that caused a huge, ruckus about, do they put the surgeons through a metal detector, or do you know what goes on? But he should not have had his cell phone.
We had something like that in Virginia, and it was the exact same thing. It was a guy who had a colonoscopy, and they said, right, put all your clothes in the bag, and they put it under his gurney, and then he left the cell phone on because he knew he wasn't going to remember what the doctor told him. And does anyone remember this story? It was huge. It went worldwide, and they sort of trash talk. And it was also about his genitalia. I don't know what it is about men and, And so when he woke up, he listened to his cell phone, and he got to hear them discussing all that. And he sued. So now that's why there's, no cell phones, nowhere, no how.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
So.
interesting source of surveillance. But anyway, you can learn. And so what we know now is that politicians need to die in the ambulance or the hospital. If
Yeah,
you want
yeah,
to think
yeah,
of the Supremes right now as politicians in
yeah.
robes, which is pretty much what they are, then you have
Right,
to think
right,
about that, right?
right. Well, it was I, again, I talked to a couple of police officers. One, do you know David Swinson? He helped me with the DC cop part, and he was telling me, he said, Ellen, it has to be an alley where they find him, because he said there's security cameras all over Capitol Hill. Who knew, So it was an alley. And there's just all these little things that there was so
Right.
much research involved in sort of getting it right in this book, because it is Washington and people know the city. So, and
But
if you get,
I think increasingly you crime writers have to be aware that there's security cameras everywhere,
mm-hmm.
in every elevator, in every hallway, in every,
But
it's
you
almost
it's like,
impossible to be
this
honest.
one wasn't working. I mean, you
Yeah,
have to have
right. You have
some.
to disable it. I
Really, it's
know.
like, well, I don't know. Did we turn it off and we didn't turn it back
Right.
on?
It's like having the battery, go dead on
Yeah,
the
yeah,
cell phone is
yeah.
the way to eliminate that. I mean, technology is a constant challenge for a crime writer to figure out how to
Unless you
overcome it.
said it in the 1980s, like Sue did.
Right.
Yeah.
So anyway, we can't tell you what happens after the judge goes off
Never
in the
mind.
ambulance, but it's a really neat story, and
Thank
it
you.
doesn't go where you think it's going to go, which I
Thank you.
loved.
Yeah.
I usually can tell, but I have to say I was really surprised.
Thank you.
Yeah, right. So thank you. I'm going
Thank you
to
all.
ask you to turn your microphone over to Kate.
I will. Thank
All
you all.
right.
Okay.
They will be back because all three of them are going to wind up and then answer questions, so forth. So this is my friend Kate White, whom I met in New York when she was still the editor of Cosmo and was kind enough to invite me, 14 years, wasn't it?
14 years.
That's right. Was kind enough to invite me down to spend a morning at Cosmo, which is one of the more interesting days of my whole life. I know. I loved it. And you've had, besides you've had some writers. Who is the lovely, it should be Green. Is it Green?
Yeah, it's green. Does
Right.
this seem on?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
You're good. So who is the lovely young man who has written a number of great novels he was at Cosmo?
Oh, John Searles.
That's it.
Yeah.
John Searle.
He's still one of my closest friends. At Cosmo, it was such an incredibly diverse, cool crowd of people, because if you worked there, you kind of appreciated over the top. So everybody who worked there was over the top, and I'm still really close to so many of the people who worked for me there.
You told me in the car coming back from brunch that Jessica Knoll was somebody that you mentored
Yeah,
at Cosmo.
did any of you read A Luckiest Girl Alive or see it lately? Jessica was an assistant right out of college. She came to work there, and I just felt so strongly, wow, she is so talented. So we had a column that I created called the Bedroom Blog when the internet exploded. And once the writer had been doing it for a few years, decided not to do it anymore, I said, Jessica, why don't you do it? Because it was fiction. And she did acknowledge me in her book. And not long ago, she sent me an email that I had sent her when I was encouraging her to write fiction, of all the books I thought she should read. And I'd forgotten I'd done that. And it was so touching that she did that. But she's so talented, and loved her.
Smile at me. There you go. I'm doing my Instagram photos. I'm not just being an idiot. I have to catch them while I can. I know, it's ridiculous. Anyway, Kate wrote 8 books about a character named Bailey Wiggins, which had some relation to your own career, right?
Yeah, Bailey, which was really funny, Bailey was a true crime writer who ended up solving mysteries. And while I was at Cosmo, we discovered that as much as our readers loved articles about sex, they loved true crime. And Linda Fairstein wrote a wonderful series for me called From the Files of Linda Fairstein. And I ended up hiring an editor who assigned a lot of the true crime pieces for us, and also articles on how to prevent crime, because young women are such potential victims. And I realized, and in a way, like Bailey Wiggins could have worked at Cosmo. So it was just kind of ironic in that sense.
She also had a really great day at a spa, which ended badly in many respects. But one of the books you had, and I thought, there's Kate taking advantage of some Cosmo
that
day at
research
some great
was
spa.
so tough to do. I tried everything, the hot oil massage on the forehead, the, millions of different types of hot stone massages. But you've got to do the research, right?
So this was all before Goop, wasn't it? What would you have done covering Goop if it had been around while you were at Cosmo?
Well, I'll tell you what I feel is a problem for young women today who do look to social media is that it's not fact checked. At Cosmo, everything was fact checked. We had a team of fact checkers. So we never recommended a product the way influencers do because they're being paid to do it. Even with advertisers who we had to respect, my beauty editor would make sure she found the best of the advertisers' products. We never did anything that we didn't feel our readers are going to find this of value. And somebody told me the other day that the whole influencer culture is starting to catch up as more people who try the mascara that the influencer recommends and discovers this is worthless. It's finally starting to blow back on them.
I hope so. I've ordered a few clothes because when I'm scrolling through it, working for the store, once in a while I see something. You can kind of tell from the price what the quality will be. All right, so that's a clue right there. But now I've started reading the comments, and the problem is that some of them are just hateful, and
no.
you can't trust the negative comments any more than you can trust
Right.
the positive comments. So, you're right. When it was like newspapers didn't used to have fake news, and, Cosmo didn't have like fake, spa stuff.
Yeah,
And
really.
now it's very hard to know what you can trust anymore about anything.
That is so true.
And that's certainly true of your book. So, this book is another one where you absolutely will be amazed when you get to the end because you will not see it coming. But why don't you describe it for us, and I'll fill you in if you've forgotten any of it because I just read it.
Yeah, I'm about to hand in the 2024 book. It's about a young woman who's a graphic designer in New York City named Skylar Moore, who gets a call one day from a lawyer. And as soon as she hears it, on the voicemail that it's an attorney, she says she gets that sense of dread you get when you're in an airport and see one of those canine German shepherds, and you think, wait, did I swallow a condom with cocaine in it today and not remember it? Um, but he tells her that she has received is going to receive an inheritance from a client of his who died a week ago. And at first she's giddy. Oh my gosh, life is about to take a turn for the better. But she doesn't recognize the name, Christopher Whaley. But he says, no, you are the person. And when she goes to his office a couple days later, and he starts to fill her in more about what's going on, she realizes it's a man she had a one night stand with 12 years before. And in the old days, if you had a one night stand, the most you could hope for is to be called Angel of the Morning, right? Go back in the day. But he has left her $3.5 million, and she doesn't know why. And it becomes clear fairly quickly that the stakes are high, that his wife is coming after her, going to try to prove she extorted the money, and she she has to figure out why he left her the money. And the more she digs, the more she finds some secrets that become threatening for her. And so it becomes really a race for her to understand and figure it out. And what makes it difficult for her is that because she tries to think back, was there anything about that night that would give her a clue as to why he left her so much money? It was the same weekend her half sister disappeared, so it's very painful for her. And there's a parallel story here from 12 years before the weekend her sister disappeared. So it's dual timelines.
Right. So I think it's a fascinating premise, right? I mean, she thinks at first, of course, that the lawyer, because I'm trying to remember, has her boyfriend just kicked her out?
Well, it's
There's,
more that Skylar, because she feels such guilt about what happened to her sister, she's kind of become reclusive over time and a little ornery. And the guy she was dating finally just says, it's just too hard with you. Where I got the idea, sometimes you're asked, where did the idea come from? And sometimes I don't even remember because the little germ that starts it. ends up, blowing up so quickly in your mind, it's hard to trace it back. But with this, a number of years ago, when my mom died, several years ago, we had this weird thing happen where my brother, who was the executor, was trying to track down one of her IRAs and was told it was sent to a woman we never heard of. And we start to get kind of panicky. Did my mother have this secret life? Is there some child we didn't know about? And it turns out it was a relative of ours who had been married many times, and this was one of her married names. And my brother said to her, why didn't you let us know? What did you do with the money? And she said, well, I renovated part of my apartment with it, and the rest I gave to orphanages. The old gave it to an orphanage line. But it turned out to be a bank error. And they gave us the money, wrote a check for us. But it got me thinking, what if it had been sent to somebody we didn't know intentionally, and my mother had a secret? Or what if I got money from someone I didn't know? And that kind of led to the idea.
No, it's a really very clever idea. And I think only a person who's lived in New York a long time could really describe the studio, because what she is she's a collage artist,
Yeah.
right? Which is sort of a thing now, a shadow box. Do you mean any of you read Luann Riley? Because she wrote a really terrific book. I think it was, am I right, John, called The Shadow Box? And the cover actually had, the box with the little compartments in it. And there are like found things in a shadow. It's like a memory box, right?
Yeah. Well, collages, I wanted Skylar, because she's a graphic designer, what she really wants to be is an artist, and that's what she'd studied in school before her life got derailed in graduate school. And so I just became intrigued with collage art. I think, and I have Skylar say this, it was the big Matisse show at Museum of Modern Art a number of years ago where I saw his cutouts. And really, there are a lot of famous artists like Picasso and a lot of wonderful female artists who do collage. And I just got very interested in it. And it was actually fun. I did some, I'm a terrible artist, but I made some collages myself. It's very therapeutic.
Have you all remembered, have you visited the Thorn Rooms down at the Phoenix Art Museum? Any of you done that? You seriously, none of you gone down to the art museum? Oh, all right. You want to do that because Mrs. Thorne was a lady who inherited a ton of money. I'm trying to remember how long ago it was. I grew up in Chicago, and the Chicago Art Institute had the major collection of the Thorn Rooms. And basically what they were was like, they weren't doll houses, but she would take a room and then she would design it for the period. And she would have like tapestries woven. She would have little tiny books printed. It had real sterling silver, the whole bit. And there's a bunch of them down here at our art museum, and they go all the way from a Jacobean setting all the way around to like an Art Deco 1930s. And there's a great one with a kitchen and has a cat, and it has, knitting needles, and their gardens outside. I mean, they're terrific. But they are, in their way, they're kind of like a collage, although they're more specific, probably more organized than a
Right,
collage.
because collage, and there's assembled art too, which might have pieces. I hadn't planned this in the beginning, but as Skylar tries to figure out why did he leave me the money, what she ends up doing, this sort of came to me as I was writing, because what would be the natural way for her to try to remember that night? She makes a collage about the night. She downloads some pictures from the internet of the hotel where they stayed and other elements. And ultimately, it is through the collage indirectly that she pieces together and figures out the truth that kind of in some ways upends her life, but probably in a good way, because she can move on and sort of make peace with the past.
So if you lived in a kind of ramshackle apartment in New York City and you had a friend who was the manager of a very elegant boutique hotel, who every once in a while will call you and say, there's a room free tonight and you can come here and stay, where there was like a real bathtub and all the rest of it. That's why Skylar was in the hotel. She wasn't a hooker. She wasn't, she was there with her friend. I don't remember, was it Jacqueline, whatever her friend's name was. Anyway, has invited her to take a free room at the hotel. And she goes down to the bar to have a drink and sort of revel in the luxury of this place as compared to her own apartment. And that's where this guy is in the bar and buys her a drink, and then he goes away. I mean, it's it's just by total chance that they actually
Right.
end up together.
Right. I actually
You
had a
did that
friend.
very well.
A, a friend of mine used to have a friend at a hotel who would do that for her occasionally. Is, hey, we've got some vacancies tonight. How about a key card? And you can just come by. I don't know how common that is today with some security in most hotels. It's interesting what you said about the CCTV. There's a woman who has helped me with all my books named Barbara Butcher, and she has a memoir coming out in June called What the Dead Know.
Pause right there. We're doing an event with her and Patricia Cornwell, who she has helped with all of Patricia Cornwell's book. It's a Zoom event on June 23rd.
Yeah,
Just make a note.
she has helped me with every book. And I remember years ago, she was saying, we were talking about DNA, and DNA was, well, look, we saw what happened in Idaho, right? Uh, DNA is gonna undo that guy. But really, ultimately, now what she would say is CCTV is really what does you in, because it's every place. There was a period of time where it was so much more common in the UK, but now it's everywhere. And that's ultimately how he got caught, because a woman who worked at a gas station stayed up and watched all their coverage after there was a outreach from the police saying, we need your help. And she saw the white car. And that kind of led to eventually the police at the University of Washington figuring out who he was.
If you were an addict of British crime shows like me, you would know that there's nothing that, Vera, any of you watch Vera? What's the first thing she says? Check all the CCTV, the road cameras, the whole thing.
Yeah.
It was like that Call of Duty, if you watch Call of Duty. I
Oh,
mean,
yeah.
so Britain is basically a surveillance state.
Yeah.
It truly is. And it's been slower to come here. One of the best crime novels I ever read. Barry Maitland wrote this wonderful series of British crime. This is not a commercial because I don't think it's even in print. But he started out in London. He must have written this 15 years ago at the Chelsea Flower Show. And it looked like there was an accident where somebody was hit by a truck, if I remember this right. Somebody came out of the flower, and anyway, it looked like a hit and run or whatever it was. But after a while, they began to suspect that it had been deliberate. And the way they figured that out was the guy was wearing what the British call trainers, which are basically very fancy tennis shoes like Nike or something. And they had a distinctive metallic stripe. And using CCTV, they traced that guy from the truck down in the underground, all the way across London, up in the elevator, and to the door of his flat. I mean, it was really amazing, it's like a hue and cry. It really was a hue and cry using CCTV. If the guy hadn't been wearing the flashy shoes, they probably never could have caught him. But, because the shoes had some distinctive, whatever it is, they could find him.
Have you seen The Capture yet? Have any of you seen that? It's a show in which the British government creates CCTV footage of people they're not going to be able to arrest otherwise.
Oh my God, it's fake TV.
And it's fake CCTV. And it's coming with AI.
With
probably.
AI.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I know it. You're not going to be able to tell the difference anymore. Anyway, Between Two Strangers is a wonderful book. And I love the characters. And basically, everybody in it is well-intentioned, which is not true of most crime novels. But there's really no bad guy in it. It's a series of unfortunate events that overtake people. And that probably is more realistic, don't you think? There aren't that many supervillains out there.
Yeah, that's part of why I enjoyed writing it, because it wasn't about a serial killer, but it was about consequences and more the domino effect that happens in life sometimes.
Absolutely true. Also, it could only really take place in Manhattan. That's that's what I think. So,
Thanks,
Jen,
Barbara.
where are you? Right. There you are. Come on, John. I'm going to pass the microphone to you. So John is going to be talking to Jen, and then all three authors will be up here, and John will ask his usual incredibly scintillating questions to end this up. Let me get out of your way, John. Sorry.
Tag in, tag out.
Barbara does like you, Jen.
No, she doesn't. You know, she's still mad because in one book I referenced an 80-year-old person and she took high offense to it. That person had dementia. I don't know why. I don't know why she took it so personal. I tease.
Because that's your way.
Yeah.
Your new book is Summer Reading. What
Yes.
do you want to tell people about the book?
Wow. Do you guys ever just what book? Summer reading is, as a former librarian, the title Summer Reading is we're going to Martha's Vineyard, and we have a heroine with dyslexia who meets a hero who's a librarian. And a friend of mine did point out that male librarians, earmuffs, John, are
It's
not
the
known for
truth,
being
I'm
hot.
sorry.
John's a
Very few
former
exceptions.
librarian. He's clearly the exception.
No, I'm not.
But so I, of course, said, yeah, well, yes, he is. He's Keanu Reeves on a motorcycle hot. Because why not? It's fiction. So you have two characters that neither one is really looking for a relationship. One is trying to resurrect her career as a chef while she has to chaperone her 14-year-old half-brother. And they are not close. There's 14 years between them. And he, the hero, the librarian, is only there for the summer. And he's looking for the father he's never known. He doesn't even know his name. So they both have individual things happening. But their meet cute is on the ferry. He's reading a book. There's a bunch of frat boys behind her. They're on the upper deck. And one of them is about to throw up. And the only thing between... the only thing between him and the ocean is her. So the reader guy, our hot librarian, is reading a book. And as she's trying to flail to get away, she sends his book into the ocean. I know. I had people who are like, I'm going to stop reading now. You killed a book. And I'm like, oh, come on. But anyway, so that's the meet cute. And there we go.
And in your typical fashion, you had to take what's a standard thing in romance fiction and make it your own by having her
Yes.
knock the book into the ocean.
Yes.
You also take the opposites attract kind of trope.
Yeah.
He loves to read, she hates to read. Why does
Yes.
Sam hate to read?
Samantha Gale, our heroine, is a chef by trade. She's also Portuguese because when I was researching Martha's Vineyard, I found out it was settled mostly by Azorian fishermen. So much so that Oak Bluffs was called Little Portugal at one point. So we learn as we go. So when I was writing it, originally I had thought, because my agent actually came to me and said, I have a title for you. And I was like, cool, bring it, because titles are awful. And she said, Summer Reading. And I was like, yes, as a librarian. And then I thought, well, naturally, somebody has to be a librarian. And my first thought was that it would be the woman. But then I thought, it's always the girl, always. I'm like, let's make it the guy. And that's how we ended up in the conversation of, male librarians and whatnot. But what was the question?
Opposites attract. She
Oh,
hates
yeah.
to read, he loves
Why are
to
they
read.
opposite? So then I knew he was going to be the librarian. And I couldn't figure, I'm like, well, why wouldn't she like reading? What, and I had worked, John and I are both recovering librarians. And I had done a tour of duty in Phoenix Public Library. And I worked with teens. And we had a lot of troubled teens. And most had dyslexia. We found out that a lot of the kids who are disenfranchised youth, it's because they have a reading disability. And the statistics, as I started doing my research, 1 in 5 to 1 in 10 people are affected with dyslexia. So that felt like the right fit for a reason why you might hate books. And it's not so much she hates them because she's a cook, so she likes to look at the pictures, as you do. But reading is hard.
And that's such a foreign concept to most of us who love to read. It's like, how can you not like reading, but you make it believable? And without saying too much, you find a way for her to discover reading in a different format.
Yes, I did. I guess we don't want to say too much, but let's just leave it at this. We're very fortunate to live in an age where stories come to us through books, movies, audiobooks. And one of my favorite parts of the book is when they have the is the movie better debate, the movie or the book. Because naturally they both have a stake in that argument. So that was a lot of fun.
Did you draw upon your own library experiences in crafting Ben? Anything happened to him that happened to you?
I did. Ben, the librarian, you know, it's funny. I've had a few librarians push back about it because there is one librarian in the book who is not particularly likable. And I think, I know, shocking. I think for those of us, I think she was 80. Never going to live that down. But I think for most of us, there are some old school librarians. Like, how many of you have been to the library lately? Yes, lots of people, tons of hands here, just so you know. It's changed. When I left, we were doing things in youth services where we had maker spaces. So we had a 3D printer. I was teaching kids how to sew. That was my job. Playing Dance Dance Revolution was my job. So libraries have changed tremendously. And for Ben, he's, you know, helping run a robotics camp, and that's what her little brother is in. That's another little, how do you meet up with someone again kind of thing. So I did draw a lot on the library and just how much it's changed. But then we still have those old school people, you know.
Yeah, I'm one of the old school ones when Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature was a thing. Now most people don't know that.
I know.
You not only wanted to talk about how reading can be a challenge for some people through dyslexia, you put your money where your mouth is, you and your publisher and your editor and your marketing team when it came to the book itself. Can you talk about that?
I got really lucky. When I finished writing the book, and it was a marathon to really get into this character's head, because books have always been my sanctuary, my safe space. So to write from a perspective of someone who, it was, it was a stretch. So when I finished it and I felt really good about it, I had to sit with all the information I'd gotten, the number of people who are affected by dyslexia, why books are put off for a lot of people. I mean, try picturing going out to a restaurant and not being able to read the menu. Signage. You can't figure out where you are because you can't read the street sign, because most fonts are not dyslexic friendly. However, there are fonts that are very neurodivergent friendly. So when I turned in the book, you ask for these things and you never know how it's going to go. It's kind of like your cover art or, any of that. So I said, how insensitive are we going to look if we print this book in the traditional non-neurodivergent friendly font? Is there any way we can make it dyslexic friendly? And I got the So then I waited for the no money. I was totally wrong and delighted to be so. My publisher came back and they said, we'd love to do it. So this book is printed in a sans serif font called Verdana. It's spaced specifically to be easier for dyslexics to read. I have a lot of emphasis. Stop laughing.
No, not you. You're so demure.
I am. No, kidding. But instead of italics, which I use a lot, we went with bold, so that it would be easier for them to read. And then the other thing that they did, which was amazing, when you're reading a book and they hyphenate at the end, make it all look pretty, fit as many words. And they didn't. The designers went through and they made sure every word was fully, no hyphens, no cut in half. And then they spaced the type so that it was easier too. So for the win. So we got very lucky.
That was fortunate, and it's important to let those tuning in virtually know you can support this kind of diversity in publishing by buying the book.
Yes.
Because if it's not successful financially, publishers don't do it. So that's...
And the trick with it too, my books don't usually come in with as many pages. This is a 480-page book, and it's mostly because of the new spacing. And obviously with paper and printing and costs like that, it is prohibitive. And in defense of e-readers, Barbara, cover your ears. No, instead she does this. Earmuffs. In defense of e-readers, one of the things that a lot of the e-reading companies have caught on to is that you could go in and set it not only to a dyslexic friendly font, but there is one font in specifically that's for dyslexia, and it's bottom heavy and it's easy to read. And a lot of times you can go in on those readers and change the font. So
Which is
Barbara
very
didn't hear that.
cool. Right.
it is very
So
cool.
I'm going to say, I was surprised the other day because I don't normally watch our videos on Facebook and YouTube because I'm in them, right? I'm the one doing the conversation. But as it happened, I had to do one. And to my great surprise, there was a whole translation going on below because we are now required to have typography for the deaf. But I have to tell you that some of the wording is hilarious because the AI does not necessarily recognize what the author or what we were saying. So I'm not sure where that's taking us. But I do think there's a conscious effort, to make material available for people who. I always think of Stephen Cannell. Do any of you remember Maverick and all the incredible? Well, he also wanted to be an author. He was way better at television than he was at writing. But nonetheless, he came here for all his novels, and he was acutely dyslexic. I mean, acutely. And I gave him huge points for writing, books as opposed to, doing Maverick and other great stuff.
And
on
his editor
television.
too. Huge
Yeah,
points.
right.
The caption thing, one hilarious thing, you heard
Yeah.
me say meet cute earlier. My social media did automatic captions, and it was meet, MEAT. Cute. And I was like,
But actually, maybe.
maybe. Yeah, well played.
Before we bring our other authors up, you mentioned Portugal and its influence in New England. Your character, Sam, does a lot of cooking. Did you have to research a lot of Portuguese recipes?
I did, and I'm very fortunate. My sister-in-law is from the Azores. She came over when she was 7. So I went home one weekend, and her mom, her sister, her niece, and my sister Natalia spent a whole weekend cooking. So we had all the caldo verde and the tuas mush, and we included some of the recipes in the book. But what was hilarious, I didn't do any cooking. I just sat there and took notes because, some people are not gifted in the culinary arts. Baking I can do, cooking I cannot do. But it was so funny because most of the conversation was in Portuguese, and the one thing I could keep picking up was "mais sal," more salt. And there was a very, very heated debate about how much salt should go in the caldo verde. So yes, so I did include the recipes in. I'm just really fortunate that my brother married so well.
Barbara, do you want to bring the other authors up? Other authors up?
Sorry, I was
Instagramming.
doing the Instagram post. Really hard. I could hardly keep up at this point. So, Kate and Ellen, if you'll come back up, and John will have a microphone, and he can share it with Kate, and you guys.
Is this your wallet?
Yeah. No, mine's the open one. That one.
That's fine. That's fine. I just put it down.
Then I moved mine.
Okay, that's fine.
Right.
All right.
There you go. All right.
I have a question to start with for Kate. Is it true that your novel writing career started with an astrologer?
Oh my God. I think how'd you know that? Years ago, when I was the editor of Red Book, before Cosmo, I had this woman come in who wanted to do an astrology column for Red Book. And I didn't really think it was quite right for us. But while she was in my office, she said, "Do you want me to read your palm?" And I had 2 young kids that I was so stressed, and just having her touch my hand and play over it was like a hand massage. And I was like, I was in heaven. But she said to me, and I had a really pretty office, and she said, "You love this life and it's wonderful, but there's another part of you that wants to be in a small little home office all by yourself doing something different." And I realized, as much as I love my magazine career, there was a part of me that did want to write for many years suspense fiction. And it was so odd that she saw this part of me. And it's really that point that I started thinking, yeah, I want to do this before I run out of time. And I didn't write, I've written 17 suspense novels, but I didn't write the first one until my late 40s.
I have another question now for Ellen, because you had a really great quote that I read somewhere. In journalism, if you make up stuff, you get fired. In fiction, if you don't make up stuff, you get sued. What does that mean to you as a writer?
That so I wrote an article for Crime Reads that came out a couple of weeks ago, and it's still not on my website because I've been running around. But Brad Parks said that. Do you all know him? He's a Virginia author. He's taken a year off, but he worked for the New York Star Ledger and he worked for the Washington Post, and it's true. And so what I did is I interviewed. I asked Brad, Hank Philippi Ryan, Lindy Walker, Dan Fesperman, and me. I think that was all. And so I said to everybody, like, what was the hardest part? Which we talked about what in journalism makes a good writer. And I think there were a lot of things that I came up with. We're used to deadlines. We're used to finishing things. We're telling stories. But everybody, all of us, the hardest part was going from making things from writing just the facts to making things up and making that transition. So you really do have to make sort of a mental shift. And Brad had another funny line too. He said, "I still feel like all my books have to be double sourced," like, and Dan Fesperman said the same thing. He said it took him a long time to sort of realize he didn't have to refer to his reporter's notebook, when he was writing the story. And it was sort of the same thing for me. My first book was very much lifted from my journal in Russia, and it is hard. That's like, well, just make it up, and when you read the paper more and more, it's like anything can happen. And I remember David Baldacci telling a story one time, I think it was on his masterclass, where he said he wanted to consult with somebody at, I think it was the CIA, which is in our backyard in Virginia, and he called this friend of his and he said, "I want to ask you if it's realistic." He said, "It is." And he said, "Well, I didn't tell you what it was." And he said, "If you could think it up, we've already done it."
Jen, your book is about summer reading. What's on your summer reading list?
Ooh. Ellen Crosby. Kate White. For sure. I mean, look at these. There we go. I'm pretty eclectic. I don't know about you guys, but I do different formats. So audio is always nonfiction. I don't know why. Rarely fiction. They have to be a really good narrator. I think right now I'm listening to David Goggins, Never Finished. So that's my audio. And I just got this stack of rom-coms from a certain source. So I'm fully loaded. But right now the one I'm in is The Best Men.
That's good.
Yeah, it is really good. I'm excited. So that's so far. And then I'm sure it'll blow up as, like, shiny, as you all collect books,
Kate, one of the things you also wrote that I thought was rather profound was a good suspense novel is about character, not about plot twists.
Well, I guess I would say I think both are important, but more and more as I find that a lot of suspense fiction, I don't know if you feel this, some of it's so over the top and outrageous. I'm left like, oh my gosh, she doesn't have just one serial killer in her life, she's got two. That I felt that coming back to character and letting the character drive some of what happens in the twist helps keep it more authentic. And I felt that particularly lately, as so much of what I've been reading has been somewhat disappointing for me. I just read the latest Jane Harper Exiles, which I just love because it felt as if there was an authenticity to it and it wasn't over the top so much.
Ellen, what role did stamps play in your writing career?
Stamps.
Postage stamps.
Oh. Okay, postage stamps. Well, you've really done your homework. He's a librarian, right? So, and this is another article that I wrote that my journey to publication was a story of, was it 4 countries, three children, two, and I forget what the two was, but one relentless quest for U.S. stamps. And we lived overseas. My husband was transferred to Geneva in the 1980s. And that was the dim distance days before the internet, okay? And you wrote letters, remember them? And they had envelopes and stamps. And so if you sent off a query to anybody, it had to have a SASE self-addressed stamped envelope in it. And so if you're living in, well, we were living, he he was working in Geneva, but we were living over the border in France. Where am I going to get American stamps? Because no one's going to mail it back with a French stamp on it. So anybody who'd come over was like, bring stamps, please bring stamps. So that was my passion for stamps.
Jen, you've done one collection of novellas, and that's kind of something you've done on your own. Any more interest in that direction?
Yeah, I have a lot of interest in a lot of things. I mean, isn't it hard to just, yeah. I think the problem with writers is you're halfway through your book, and these two can verify if this is true. And then the idea for the next book comes along, and you're like, oh, and it's so much more thrilling than finishing the one you're in. But you forge on. But no, I do. I think what's really exciting right now is there's so many different things you can do, so many ways. And I think a lot of publishers, if you write thrillers, they want you to write thrillers. And if you write cozies, they want you to write cozies. And if you try to get out of that job description, they're like, no, your voice is this. This is what your readers are looking for. But maybe you have an idea for women's fiction. And I just got lucky that my publisher did support me kind of keeping traditional mysteries, but also writing women's fiction. But now I'm kind of like, what else can I do? So I actually do have a kind of a paranormal traditional mystery. Have you read Simone St. James? Anybody? Yeah. Yeah. That's kind of what's brewing.
I think we have time for questions from the audience. Anyone have a question?
I don't think you can repeat the whole question.
How do we handle cancel culture and social media? There was a panel at BoucherCon a number of years ago, and I forget which one it was, but it was all people. It was like Lee Goldberg, all people who'd had their books made into movies, and that what came out of that is you don't answer, you just don't do it, you don't engage, you just let it go. And I think that's I mean, because you're just giving that person a platform, and you're just amping it up, and you're making something of it. So I don't know how you all feel, but I just don't engage.
The problem is, we have a close pal who was canceled in the most horrific way, and I won't say her name, but destroyed her career. And fortunately, she has a very good lawsuit that's moving along. But you see, as an author, I just feel I have to be so careful, run things by people, and you might not engage, but it's still going to come at you. The Twitter mob, everything, and it's a very frightening time, I think, right now. And I gave my college commencement address last year, and I purposely did not read one comment because I thought, you know what, I just said what felt true to me, being in the first class of co-eds after almost 200 years at the school. And I'm not going to read anything because it's some of it is just so hurtful and mean. You have to wonder sometimes about who are the people who are writing those comments. What is going on in their lives that they're more invested in hurting authors and hurting other people than taking care of their own business.
Yeah. I think I know where that question's coming from. I think it's important to make sure that the person who took something out of context sees the context that it was in. But the one thing I've realized is you can't change anybody's mind. If someone's decided they're offended, they're offended. And you know what? That's their right. They bought the book, they read something, they didn't like it. They're fully in their rights to complain. But as wiser people than me have said, I still got your money. And that's okay with me.
I mean, we put ourselves out there. We really, it's like we're all standing up here naked. We really bare our souls, I think, and so it's hard and it does hurt. but you grow rhinoceros hide after a certain number of years, do you think? And you have
I
to.
have a hide like a rhinoceros. Good
Yeah,
luck.
yeah.
That question also applies to booksellers. And so it's very hard not to engage back with somebody who they're reasonable complaints and then they're just awful things. And there are also people chasing authors and trying to damage them, don't carry that author and all the rest of it. So not engaging is really the only defense to it. You already know I do the Instagram thing. I never reply to a message. You cannot direct message me on Instagram because my defense to doing Instagram is I never read any of the comments. I don't care what they're saying. I put the picture up, that was my thing. And once you go down that road, you could spend all of your time engaged in it. And as Jenn said, you can't really change anybody's mind. So it's a tough customer service question.
One thing I would say, I have a big Facebook following, and the women I engage with there are just the most wonderful, fabulous women, and they share ideas for me, to me, books that I might want to read, because I do a lot of referencing of not only books but also shows that I watch, and that is the great part of social media. I feel I've just met so many wonderful women that way. I can't remember the last time I got anything negative. There are a lot of people in foreign cultures telling me I'm beautiful, men, and those I'm not interested. They're like, they have no idea how old I am. They just are sending it in. I ignore them, but the women are fantastic. And so most of them are like in Pakistan or someplace like that. Next are going to ask if I can pay their way here. But I just love that part of it, and that's been so rewarding to get to engage with a lot of readers who you might not be able to reach otherwise.
Well, the only other thing is that I don't know about you two, but I'm a total introvert. Social media is hard for me. It really is, and I'd really rather be writing, but more and more we have to be on it, and I keep thinking like, how personal do we have to get? How much do you want? What is it you want to know? And I just really struggle with it. So most of mine is, my books, or I'm going to be here, I'm, that sort of thing. And so I kind of disappear between books, kind of, and it's hard. So I don't know. Do you have a hard time with it?
I am such an introvert. You can tell. Even as a super extrovert, I struggle because I'm never really sure where the line is. And once you have someone weaponize something that is a picture of your cat, you're just kind of like, how much do I really want to share if I have to deal with this constant, yeah, he's a little chubby. Yes, he goes to the vet. I'm a good cat mom, do you see what I mean? It's like you share something that to you is nothing, and then all of a sudden this whole world is, doing this. And so you have to figure out, the skin has to really get thick, or you have to figure out what's worth sharing. But it is interesting, like now, and I don't know if you two are like this, every time I do share something, I try to look at it at all angles before I put it, like, how can this come back to roost on me? And
Well, you're on Jungle Red Riders, so you have a blog that, you guys are really very much. Do any of you read Jungle Red Riders? Highly recommended. Yeah.
Thank you.
Maybe we'll conclude, since there's no questions. Each of you tell us how we can learn more about your books. You've mentioned social media. Do you have websites? Things like that. And since we're approaching June and it's graduation time, what advice would you give to someone starting out in the world?
You mean starting out in general?
Graduating.
Yep.
Yeah, someone graduating.
Graduate, or maybe just starting out in life, or reinventing themselves.
Coming out of their coma.
Oh, and before I forget, Jenn is a good pet parent. There should be no doubt about that.
See, John's got my back. He knows
There
I'm a
you
good
go.
cat mom, and dog mom, and fish mom, and bird mom. But anyway, okay. My best advice for someone graduating is it's going to be a lot harder than you think. Do it anyway. And I genuinely believe that the effort you put in, you will get back tenfold. If you want something badly enough, you can get it. So that's my graduation advice. All cliches, but all true, which makes them so annoying. And then what was the other?
Social media.
Oh, social media, JennMcKinlay.com, and I'm on Facebook and Instagram, Jenn McKinlay.
KateWhite.com, and I was lucky enough to work for a company that early on got all the editors and chiefs names as URL. So Kate White is such a common name, but I have KateWhite.com. And as I said, I am on Instagram, but I love to talk to readers on Facebook. And in terms of advice, maybe just something I did mention last year when I gave my college commencement speech. It was a line somebody wrote in Cosmo once, but it really resonated for me. Don't believe everything you think. And that's true all through life, but specifically when you're first coming out of college, what you want is often based on what your parents wanted you to want. And it's just so important sometimes to step back and just challenge what you're thinking. And I find that even true today. Sometimes, particularly coming out of the pandemic too, to step back and just ask myself, is that really what I'm want to be thinking right now?
Um, one of my daughters-in-law is a professor of biology at Loyola University of Chicago, and she's young. And she said to me, for the first time, I think I've kind of lost touch with my students. I feel like there's a generational difference. And she said that the kids that she's taught who came to her after the years in the pandemic lost so much. They didn't have a prom, they didn't have the graduation, they didn't have everything, and it's showing up as they're coming through. And I think some of them are graduating now. And so I don't know, I just want to give everybody a really big hug because they had such a tough time, and it's been so heartbreaking to imagine what they missed that we got to have. It's just a rite of passage. And so to just say, I mean, if you're that resilient that you made it through this, you can make it through anything. And the world is going to be a changing place, but you all have managed to cope with some of the most incredible, the way the world changed, while you were growing up, and you were there for it. So I just want to hug them all. And then for me, I have a great website. I have a great website. And then I have a newsletter, which I rarely write, but so if you don't want to hear from me a lot, sign up for it. And then I love Instagram because I love photos. And then I'm sort of on Facebook. My son works for Meta. And I am on Twitter when I'm doing something. And then there's BookBub. Are you guys on BookBub? Is anybody here on BookBub? Go on BookBub, and it's a great place to get recommendations on books. And when they go on sale for like $1.99, Multiple Exposure went on sale for $1.99, and a ton of people started reading it. So that got everybody kind of involved in the series. So for all of you here, you're here because you're readers. Go on BookBub, write down, check who you like as authors, and the next thing you know, you'll start getting these very wonderful curated emails about books you will not have. Everybody's getting out their phone. You will not have heard of, who you can start reading. And many of them come in at $1.99 and you get hooked. So BookBub is my best advice for all of you.
I'd like to thank those tuning in virtually to another event here, those attending in person, and let's thank our authors, Kate, Ellen, and Jenn. We've got a table towards the back for them. If you give them a chance to get back there, we've got more copies of the books up front. I'm sure they'd love to sign copies for you and for anyone you love. Thank you.